My name is Inbal Ravreby, and today I'll talk about the many phases of mimicry depending on the social context. Ivan, I'm sorry you already heard that. This will be a very shortened version of this. Okay, so there is a bunch of literature showing that synchronization and mimicry are highly related to the interaction quality, such as affiliation, closeness, and I think we all here are familiar with this literature. But in real life, there are so many different channels, and even looking just on facial expressions, we have so many different facial expressions, right? We don't have only smiles that are highly examined. We'll have smiles, we have sad facial expressions, angry, whole bunch of literature showing variety of facial expressions, way more than only the 6 Ekmans. But today we'll focus on the 6 Ekmans. That's just so like the tip of the tongue. Just by looking at the mimicry, we can know something about the interaction, about the context. You can see here that these two photos are totally different in what they convey to the audience, right? And what we wanted to do is to ask to what degree the level of mimicry in different facial expressions is related to the social condition. And to put it in other words, what can we know about the social condition and specifically agreement or disagreement by the mimicry pattern in different facial expressions? So to test this, we went to the real life using the media, news channels such as BBC, CNN, things like that. And we recruited 150 dads of either to Democrats, to Republicans, or disagreeing dads, Republican and Democrat. So 50 in each group. We then used OpenFace to have the action units of each participant. So these are basically movement units in the faces that then you can combine them and get the different facial expressions. So we want first to look at the most common facial expressions in the literature, which are the 6 Ekman facial expressions. And then first we tested the level of expressiveness. So do people who agree or don't agree differ in the level of expressiveness in different facial expressions? So basically what we see is that, of course, it depends on the specific facial expression. So there was a main effect of the facial expression, but there wasn't an effect of the agreeable condition. So it doesn't matter if people agree or disagree, the level of expression was very similar. Okay, now let's talk about mimicry. So it's thought to be that mimicry is related to positive social interaction, but it's somehow counterintuitive when thinking about negative facial expressions, for example. So is it that universal? Do mimicry also always relevant to positive interaction? And more basically, do we always mimic each other, or is it in specific facial expressions? So first of all, we wanted to see the prevalence of mimicry. And what we found is that people mimicked each other in all facial expressions and all agreement conditions that we measured. So both when people agreed with each other or disagreed, they mimicked each other in all 6 facial expressions. So this was quite a surprise for us. And it may imply that mimicry is a very basic fundamental component for communication. So even if we disagree, we might want to successfully communicate, to understand the other, and to basically be able to have a conversation. Okay, now let's look about the different facial expressions and how the mimicry relates to the different agreement conditions. So what we found is that, again, people differ in the mimicry levels, but there is no interaction between the agreement condition and the facial expression, meaning that by the mimicry in different facial expressions, we could not differ between agreeing and disagreeing dyads. Okay, so we thought maybe it's the pattern, not some specific facial expressions. And we saw that there is different degree of mimicry in different facial expressions. So we thought, okay, let's take this mimicry levels and then put them in a classifier. So we use machine learning and tested whether by the different level of mimicry in the 6 facial expressions, we can differ between agreement and disagreement, and even between agreement between Democrats, Republicans, and people who disagree. So we actually could do that in almost 47% accuracy, where chance level was third. Like 33%. So this was a significant result, showing that the mimicry pattern is what matters here, and not the existence of mimicry. So we then tested it also in not at the whole conversation level, but also averaging each 5 seconds, just to see what happens also momentarily. And we could also classify this even slightly better in 50% accuracy. So to sum it up, although there was no difference in the expression intensity, the mimicry level in all 6 facial expressions was significantly above 0. And this is incompatible with the notion that mimicry is associated only with positive social interactions, as there was mimicry both when interlocutors agreed with each other and when they disagreed. There was a different mimicry pattern in each condition, enabling to classify the interviews to their agreement condition based on the mimicry pattern. So the take-home message is that our results suggest that not only positive interpersonal communication is characterized by mimicry, but also negative one. And this may point to a fundamental role of mimicry in the ability to basically interact and successfully communicate. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Inbal. So that was a lot in a very short amount of time, and highlighting the really important orthogonal relationship between synchry and everything else. We have to keep reminding ourselves that there isn't only this positive association. So thank you very much for that great data. I don't know who of the many experts you have available to you is going to jump in first, but thank you so much for your talk.
Thank you.
Does anybody want to jump in? You can fight for it, girls.
Well, I will if nobody else will. So,
thank you.
I think that's great, really interesting, and I will declare myself as a mimicry skeptic straight away. So in the primate world, like there's a lot of data or a lot of people suggesting that primates mimic each other in their facial expressions, and I'm always very skeptical of that, because my position is, surely they're just doing the same thing at the same time. Like, do we need to think of this as a mechanism to do with mimicry, or are they just behaving appropriately at the same time, which is often means they're producing the same behavior? So when I look at your data, I think, oh, well, no, actually, this suggests something different. It looks like you've got data really showing that they are mimicking very specific expressions that are also negative, not just smiling, because that tends to normally be smiling. So this sounds really interesting to me. But what I then wonder about is, well, and again, this is really a question because I can't see your data in front of you, and maybe you can answer this. But is it that they really are responding with a surprise or a fearful expression, or is it that what OpenFace is picking up are these sort of very tiny components of these prototypical expressions? And therefore, because what we see in our experiments is you get this flood of movement. You're not really seeing any of the basic facial expressions. You're just seeing lots and lots of movement. And we pick up about 70 action units per minute per person in normal social interaction, normal conversation. And that isn't basic expressions. That's just movement. So is it that what OpenFace is picking up, or could it be that what is being picked up is a flood of movement? And if you looked at it and if you analyzed it and said, is an angry expression responded to with a fearful expression, would you get exactly the same data? I appreciate that's a slightly controversial point. So
yeah, sure. So thanks for pointing it out, and I'm totally understand what you're talking about. So we used the action unit as continuous measure. So, like the basic Ekman facial expressions are really exaggerated, like this smile and like being like really shocked, right? And most of the time in general, people don't really that expressive, right? I mean, in normal social conversations, I'm not so expressive, and I guess all of us are not. So yeah, you're totally right. These action units are basically components of movement of different facial parts. And of course, when I'm talking about smiles, well, this may be more prominent because people tend to really smile. But regarding the other facial expressions, so it's not about the intensity. I can maybe show you the level of intensity again. It wasn't huge, right? So there is expressiveness there, but it's not very, very strong. But yet, the level of, we see that there is mimicry here. So the mimicry may be of kind of subtle facial expressions, but it still exists. You see what my point, like the differentiation that I'm doing here?
Yeah, I do, but I just wonder if if a very subtle surprise expression is actually very similar to a very subtle fear and a very subtle something else, and so it's not that these are not discrete, especially when we're talking about the very subtle movements. It could be a couple of action units that could be common to many of different expressions. Yeah. Like, I'm certainly not arguing with you. I think your data look very, very interesting and definitely a very welcome contribution to this field that I think is a smidge muddy. So, I think this is really, really great. But I think these are things that, you could maybe think about.
Yeah, I definitely agree with you. So there are two things. There are the basic movements of our face, right? And then there is the interpretation. So we call action unit 6 and 12. And sometimes also some other action units as okay, this is smile. Now, what is really smile? I mean, there is some interpretation here. In all our facial expressions, which are way more than the 6 Ekman's one, and there are many that we don't even have a name for them, there is some movements of our face, right? And then it's a question of our interpretation and social conventions. So do we interpret this as a smile and this, and what does it mean, every movement? So we now also want to go to the basics and do the same for every action unit we got separately. So this will be, without this top-down interpretation, but just asking about the fundamental facial movement here, what happens here, and do we mimic each and every action unit? So yeah, I think it's very important to go also to this level. But most of the time when we talk to people, I do think that we have this interpretation in our mind. Like when I see your faces now, some of you are smiling, some of you are thinking, and I do interpret it. I'm not only seeing your facial expressions as movements, because we express ourselves by facial expressions, right? It's a way to communicate. So I think, for me, it's kind of keeping the tense in both levels and see what happened there. And because there is so much literature about positive social interaction and mimicry, what we wanted to see is to what extent it's also the case for both positive and negative facial expressions. So this is why I wanted first to go to the interpretive level in which we have our thoughts about the meaning of the facial expressions. And then I think next is to go to the more basic way of looking at it.
I think it's a perfect answer, Inbal. So I think you basically had a lot of nodding, also lots of nodding to Bridget's comments, both about mimicry and just generally for us all need to scratch our heads a bit, maybe in unison, maybe not, to figure out, always to reflect on whether these measures are capturing what we want them to measure. I love the dynamic nature of these measures and how you're thinking about them. Never to forget that there's a signal that's being, the signaling that is behind that signal, what the person intends, and also what is being received. So there's the 3 aspects of any communicative chain that we always have to be aware of. But this is a great talk, great experts. Is there anybody else who has a question for Inbal? Otherwise, we will move on to our third speaker.
Do you have something? Just a very quick comment.
Please.
Inbal, you don't need to answer. Just something that crossed my mind while watching it. I really enjoyed it. Very original, very creative and interesting. But I thought that perhaps these politicians are very specific samples. they might be highly trained in responding to the others, in, you know, controlling their faces. And so maybe, you know, some more samples are required before, but no need to answer, just, you know, something that crossed my mind.
If you want to answer, I would love to hear it, so go ahead.
I'd be happy to answer. So thanks for saying that. Totally. I mean, I'm not saying anything about all possible interactions between people who agree or disagree. So there are specific interactions, not only because these are politicians, right? But these are interviews. So it means that they're not really talking between themselves. I mean, they're actually talking to an audience. And when we talk, you know, when we want to convince an audience, it may be different to a situation where we just naturally speak with someone, with a friend, or with someone that we even hate, right? So yeah, the level of generalization here is limited, but I think that it's like we here first show that people are generally mimic each other. I mean, in many facial expressions, and now the next step would be to see, okay, on what conditions does that happen? So we have just finished a conference yesterday talking a lot about the context in which people are synchronized or mimicking each other. So I think this is just the next level here to see, okay, now what about friends? What about people who are total strangers? So to what extent we can generalize these results? Is it the case that in all social conditions, just in order to communicate, we have to mimic each other? Or is it that specifically here where we want to convince an audience, then we do it as a kind of a strategy? I don't know.
Thank you so much. Yeah, I think the word strategy has come up a couple of times today, and I think it's something, you know, whether it's how we synchronize, how we mimic, how we interpret, it's always valid.